Have you ever wondered how pilots get around in the air and do they ever get lost? We'll explain all of that on this episode of Aviation Intrigue.
This is aviation intrigue.
So that reminds me of when we started to learn to fly way back when. My flight instructor would be very familiar with the area, and I'm so focused on flying. I had really no idea where things were because honestly, things look very different from the air, from the cockpit of the airplane, even if it's a small airplane, compared to when you are in a car.
I think I got lost on my first cross country with my instructor because he didn't do much prep, and we had we had the visual sectional map, how we get around with the landmarks and highways on it, and I was asked to match up where we were with what I could see out the window, and all the double highways looked the same to me. So it took me a while to get the hang of it in that first couple of hours. But then by the time I was ready to do those by myself, I was a little bit better at reading the map.
Yeah, when you're driving, you have road signs, right? In many places, you're on I-90 or whatever, there's road signs, and typically there are street signs and you know where to turn. Um, if not, you can always pull to the side and ask somebody at a gas station
That's how they
in
used
an
to do
airport.
it.
Right. It's kind of hard. Again, even if you're really, really good at reading a map, which I've always been good at map. In fact, when I was young, whenever we travel, I will collect maps. So I had like this big box of maps from everywhere I had visited. But those maps really weren't that helpful when you're trying to look at landmarks or even big geographical features from up in the air.
Yeah, that's true. The maps only give you a few highlights. It doesn't give you a lot of detail, and everything it can sometimes be jumbled together. But it's a skill you learn because you're up there, at least when you're first starting out, learning to fly by reading this very vague map that doesn't have directions, doesn't have roads, doesn't have signs. And so it's definitely a learning process. And we'll talk later about GPS, but it's something that we still insist that people learn today.
Right. I think reading map, by the way, we should explain that there are aviation specific maps. So we're not taking a regular map, if you will. You don't print out something from Google Maps or something, go flying. So there are aviation maps. We call them sectionals. You mentioned that. And those can have details, and there are these wide scale maps, and then there are maps that get narrower and narrower, so you get more and more details. But again, that doesn't have all the details no matter how much detail it has.
No, it doesn't. I think the best use of those sectional maps we use in flying visually using landmarks on the ground are airports. So they show up really prominently on these maps as pink or blue dots. And so if you're just starting out, just even going to the next airport and then going on from there to the next airport is a good way to not get lost because that's the best use. And everything else is a little bit hard to pick out sometimes.
Yeah, so I recall I think one of the first times I was flying is that, okay, well, there's this railroad, we'll follow it, and there's a lake, and we'll go there, and there's this, a bunch of trees that we can follow. Honestly, that really didn't work out that well because railroads are not always easy to spot from the air because from the top it's just these two parallel lines, and unless there's like gravel or whatever, it's kind of hard to spot. And lakes and ponds can be very seasonal, so if it's dry, the lake levels are lower, so you may or may not be able to spot. It can even depend on the sunlight, like which angle the sun is coming from. So what may be visible in the morning may not be visible in high noon or when the sun is setting from a different angle.
Oh, definitely. And if you're flying in the summer versus winter, it's completely different. So even though the roads and railroads might stick out, you're definitely not going to see snow-covered lakes and things like that. And so that's something that can make it really hard to get lost because you don't know exactly which railroad or road you're following.
Yeah, we talked about in an episode of seasonality of flying. Now imagine flying in the winter with snow covered everywhere, and even the roads look like fields, and the fields look like railroads. So that makes it very, very interesting.
And yet, getting lost is actually not as common as it sounds, even when you're first starting out learning, because you've got a long time in the direction you think you should be going to figure out where you are. And you're generally in an airplane that is not moving very quickly, sometimes only a little bit faster than highway speed. So there is time to find a way. And even though you can't pull over and ask for directions, we do have extra tools these days in case you do get lost.
Yeah, that's very true. We call it pilotage, which is a term we use for being able to visually see and then maybe use the map as a secondary aid to figure out where you are. Here's the good thing though. When you're up there, even if you're only like 3,000, 4,000 feet up, you can see a much wider area. So you can see far ahead than, let's say, if you're sitting in a car, you can only see what street you're in. But from an air, you can see a much wider area. Sometimes if you're 7, 8,000 feet up, you can see for miles.
That's a really good point. That's a really good way to look out and make sure that you're confirming, okay, that big lake that's supposed to be 10 miles ahead, I see it, because that's not something you could necessarily do in the car. And one of the fun things that I learned when I first started flying was other pilots were telling me that they used to fly around the countryside with a map and a compass. And if they weren't sure where they were, they would descend down over the nearest town and read the water tower. And I've actually done that a few times to figure out where I am, or thankfully to confirm where I am. But using that practice the way they used to do pilotage was a lot of fun. So that's actually one of the first things I learned.
I guess you have to be aware of regulation that how low you can descend over
Yes,
towns.
yes. Yeah, it can't go too low, but usually you can get just low enough to read a water tower, and it's actually kind of fun.
Yeah, so even when you're learning modern avionics, modern airplanes, it is not uncommon for instructors to start you with this pilotage, visually being able to recognize where you are, being able to read these maps and being able to look at the map and see where you are. In fact, many of the instructors would on purpose kind of throw you off guard, if you will, and then figure out if you can find where you are by triangulating or looking at, oh, there's that lake, there's that railroad, there's that town, and then kind of, it teaches you how to have that basic skills.
Absolutely. And then you start building on the other tools with that, and you gain some confidence on the way. But I will tell you, because we talked about on a previous episode about road trips in the sky, that is one of the most fun ways to travel in a smaller, slower airplane, because you can look around on a great day and enjoy the scenery, and you'll always know where you're at.
Yeah, in some airplanes, that's all you have. Therefore, that's all you can use. Now, in the next segment, we'll get into a little bit of how we can use radio signals to navigate.
So with radio navigation, you can call that an add-on to using the sectional map to fly around via landmarks, because you're not giving up the map or the landmarks when you're flying cross country, again, in clear weather when you can see what's going on the ground. But that map also has all the radio beacons along the ground around you or in your vicinity to help you get around as well. That's a little bit hard to explain, but Gopal, you had a really great analogy, and that's the lighthouse.
Yeah, so I tend to look at this as a lighthouse. So if you're a sailor or if you're in a ship, they usually look at the lighthouse at the shore and they know where that harbor is or the port is, and they can navigate to it. Of course, it doesn't tell you if there are rocks or anything in the way between you and the lighthouse. But these radio navigation, by the way, these radio navigations uh, have existed for a very long time, decades, right? And they used to be sort of the modern technology at that time, even during warplanes, that they would be able to pick up these radio signals and kind of home in on it and know where they're going. The big difference, Elaine, is that in, in a lighthouse, if you see a lighthouse, you can see, okay, there's a lighthouse, let me go to it. But you have no idea if it is north of you, south of you, southeast of you, you have no idea. And so these radio navigation that we typically use in airplane flying, we call it VOR. I won't even mention what it stands for, but VORs are like lighthouse, except they also tell you what direction you are in with respect to where the radio navigation aid is and where you are.
And that's where that very basic skill, along with pilotage, is getting familiar with compass directions. So you mentioned knowing where you are in relation to that radio beacon on the ground that you're trying to get to. Are you north of it, south of it, northwest of it? That's something you'll learn, and you have instruments in the aircraft to also let you know, including just the basic liquid compass, which direction you're headed.
Yeah, in the simplest case, we find one of these radio beacons, VORs, and we can navigate from wherever we are towards it. All you need to find out is line up your airplane and go towards it, right? But it can get a little bit more sophisticated. Let's say you're trying to go not directly towards one of this. In fact, Elaine, in most cases, it is not a bad idea for you to zigzag your path to go towards one radio beacon and then to the next one and then another one, even if it's not a straight line to your destination.
Oh, yeah, it's like hopscotching across airports because that's a similar way of navigating.
Exactly. But now, if you have a way in your airplane, many of the modern airplanes do, to be able to pick up more than one of these signals, you could then triangulate, if you will, to figure out, okay, this one is here, this one is there, and then you can plot a path which is not directly to either one of them, but you have to do a little bit math. I mean, modern day avionics do all the math for you. In the previous case, you have to take a map, take a plotter, draw all these lines and figure out what direction you're headed to.
Okay, if I'm starting out with you as my flight instructor, I just got a little bit confused about you mentioning taking out a plotter and figuring out where I am on the map. I'm not really doing that while I'm flying, right?
Well, no. So we typically try to do that in what we call as a pre-flight planning, right? I mean, let's
Okay.
let's go back to the primitive days. You'll take this map, and it's not that different than how you used to travel by road, even 20 years ago. You go get a map. Typically, you go to a AAA and get this map, and then plot. Okay, I'm going to take this road, and then I'm going to make a right, and then go for 200 miles, and then go this. It's the same kind of things, but now you're plotting. Now, typically, you're not plotting while in the air, but it's doable. In fact, if you got lost or if you're trying to figure out where you are, or if you change your destination because of weather, you will have to rely on those tools. So I'm glad the avionics have gotten better. And that's why, Elaine, I think you mentioned a few times, both in this show and before, that sometimes flying these primitive airplanes with basic information is kind of fun.
It really is fun. And if you just have that map and some geographic awareness and good clear weather, you can definitely get around. And just adding on the radio navigation kind of lets you go a little longer distances. Maybe the weather doesn't have to be perfect. The visibility can be down a little bit because you've got that extra tool to help you get around. And by the way, those are all listed on the map. And so I like your description of going from one to the other, especially if you're got a multi-state trip.
Yeah. So the one thing that kind of starts to work against us is that previously, let's say 20, 30 years ago, it was very common. In fact, it was the only way to navigate using these radio beacons, and they were located at different parts of the town. Some cases they're right at the airport. Some cases they're in the middle of a town. Some cases they're in the middle of nowhere. But it gives you sort of a network to navigate. But unfortunately, it's very expensive to maintain this. So as the time progressed and sophisticated technology like GPS that we'll talk about a bit later came about, they started decommissioning these VORs or radio beacons. And therefore now there are much fewer left. So it's kind of hard to do this, especially in, let's say, west of US, where things tend to be, wild lands.
Yeah, sometimes these VORs can be pretty far out, but you may have seen one when traveling on the road. If you ever see something near an airport, on an airport, or sometimes just in the middle of a farm field that looks like almost a giant bowling pin or an upside down white colored cone, that is actually the radio beacon that we're talking about. So there are still a few scattered about, even though they are going down in number.
Yeah, so good question to ask. Have you seen one of these bowling pin type devices or big structures that are in an airport? Next time you're in an airplane, look for one and let us know in the comments if you have seen one.
Before we go to the ultimate form of air navigation, we're going to throw in the aspect of air traffic control. And we've talked about this on previous episodes where we described air traffic controllers as helpers on the ground. And in your flights, you can use them as an optional service to either help you confirm where you're navigating, or in those very rare cases where you do get lost, you can call upon them for help or if you need assistance.
Yeah, so air traffic control, whether they are a wide area air traffic controller or somebody who's just controlling a control tower at a particular airport, many of them have radar. And radar is something that most people are intuitively familiar with. And the nice thing is, because they can see the airplane on their radar scope, they can literally direct the airplane to say, fly north, fly, now turn 20 degrees to the left. They can give you the kind of directions. And because they see you, they don't have the ultimate resolution, but they kind of know where you are. So literally, they're sitting on the ground, if you will, on this scope, and they can direct you. And when you're flying on instrument approaches, this is the only way to fly. But if you're flying visual with pilotage and you get lost, they can kind of help you. Or when you're in a weather and say, hey, I need to navigate around this weather, they can say, okay, well, fly this direction for 20 minutes, and then I'll have you turn towards your destination. And that's a pretty common way to do it.
Oh, sure. So if you're not equipped or you're not rated as a pilot to fly in the clouds, you mentioned instrument flying, air traffic control can still help you either remain unlost or remain out of the clouds where you shouldn't be going. Or in the case of things like thunderstorms, they can help you steer around it. So that's a pretty essential service.
Yeah, we call it vectoring. It's just a fancy terms for they tell you directions. That's all it is, but we call it vectoring. They use radar typically for it.
Sure. And one thing that we do teach new pilots to be careful of is that air traffic control is great, but they're not a replacement for you. In fact, air traffic control will generally maybe help you with vectors temporarily. But most of the time when you're flying, they rely on you to be doing your own navigation. And that's where you can keep in touch with them. But there are too many airplanes for them to continue vectoring all across the country, all across the sky. So you keep in mind that your navigational skills are still in play here.
100%, especially when you're flying visual or when you're near busy airspaces, they may not have the time to direct you. The other thing is that this radar may go down. It's possible for the radar to go down either because of planned maintenance or unexpectedly. And then the other thing is that, let's say you're flying in a mountainous area or a remote area, radar coverage may not be available. Then you have to kind of rely on your map and being able to visually see or fly using instruments in your airplane.
Yeah, that's a great reason not to let yourself get lost if you're getting vectors from air traffic control. And there have been some notable radar outages. I can remember one recently in Chicago, and that literally affected everyone from airlines on down. So it can be a pretty big deal if that happens.
Yeah, if you're airlines, those big iron flyers, they have no other choice. They have to depend on it. For us, little, single engine planes, we can navigate around us as long as we stay away from the weather and we stay away from the busy airspaces.
Definitely. So that's an option.
Yeah, so that brings us to today's modern technology, which is GPS.
GPS is something that when it was becoming popular in most of the cars, and now people just have those on their phones, it had been a huge, huge change for aviation because now you don't even have to have the radio navigation. And that's why that's on the downside in terms of numbers. Most of us are now, regardless of the mode we're flying in, using GPS in the airplane, which everyone has to admit has been one of the coolest things to happen lately.
Yeah, exactly. So if you have a smartphone on your hand, chances are you use Google Maps or Apple Maps or some way on the GPS. That's what is happening. The biggest difference is GPS uses satellites to pinpoint where you are. And they can tell you not just left to right where you are, but in many cases, you can also get altitude information, which is very useful when we are flying. So GPS, what started as a luxury, is now considered pretty much a necessity. And in fact, if you're modern airplanes, that's the only way to fly.
That is definitely an amazing feature. When you have new airplanes, they're installed right in the airplane and come with all the features. They can even have a form of weather radar. And like you said, it gives you all the information you need for how fast you're going, how high you are. It's a supplement or even sometimes the primary flight instrument that you use. And as a backup, I think most pilots are using a portable device just in case that main GPS goes down. you can still just use the same GPS that you've been using to drive your car around in your phone.
Yeah, so we mentioned GPS apps like Apple Maps and Google Maps. In airplane, we have aviation specific maps. Remember, we talked about the sectional maps. So think of it as the digital version of a sectional map. And by combining GPS, now these uh, aviation maps, if you will, we call it moving maps, and they can pinpoint where you are depending on the resolution of the equipment on board, and they can tell you what direction you're going. In fact, they can even predict where you're going to be in, let's say, 6 seconds from now or in 10 minutes from now. And that is very, very useful, especially now the chances are much less that you will get lost.
Definitely. And that brings us to a couple of the caveats you're going to have with GPS. Just like radio navigation or air traffic controllers radar, GPS can go down. I'm sure everyone's experienced a satellite outage when they're navigating to a new destination in their car. And that happens every once in a while in the air. So you have to be ready and have those other tools at hand, because it's happened to me a few times where the signal suddenly went out and you don't have your GPS.
Yeah, so satellites going down, and airplanes, unlike cars, need more GPS because we are looking at three-dimensional positioning and we are looking at much more precision. So therefore, if the satellites go down and there's not enough backup, it is possible that you kind of don't know where you are, right? The other thing is that the equipment on board to receive it can go bad also. That's the same thing as like maybe your cell phone ran out of battery. And it sounds like a joke, but that's also possible. And in a cockpit, things can get overheated, and so your devices may stop working. You may run out of power. So there's a lot of caveats that you need to know.
Definitely. The new airplanes that have the GPS installed in them are incredibly reliable compared to the portable devices. We'll point that out. But we always are prepared just in case there's an electrical problem or something else goes bad. I had once in my life a GPS screen that was installed in the airplane, brand new, freeze up on me. And so I wasn't getting updates on the position. And so you're just prepared for those glitches happening. And so you do still have the skills of pilotage. You can carry backup GPSs, which is the first backup people use. But all those skills come together to make flying really safe these days.
Yeah, in fact, there's technology like auto land where they can actually help you find an airport and even land your airplane. Those kind of technologies exist. We'll talk about it in a future episode. But to me, GPS has become necessity.
It's definitely the way of life now, whether you're in your car, in your airplane, in your boat, traveling anywhere. That's the way everybody gets around.
Yeah, thank goodness that we don't have to rely on some of these radio beacons, although it's a good idea to know how to use it just in case the GPS is jammed. We would love to know how reliant are you on GPS, whether you're going for a walk or in your car, because that's very similar to in an airplane. This program is for information and entertainment purposes and are not meant as flight instruction, legal, or medical advice.
This is